I'm FDRawr. I stream myself losing at video games over on Twitch, as well as making the occasional YouTube video about anything that happens to be rattling around in my noggin. The console wars require no introduction, but we're gonna do one anyway. Before the removal of the Great Barrier, that is to say, before cross-console online gameplay was as widespread as it is today, brand allegiances reigned supreme among gamers. Most folks were either a PlayStation player, or an Xbox savant, or a Nintendo kid in the 1990s and 2000s. And this actually had a set of attributes tied to it. In my personal experience, players who exclusively played on Xbox tended to be hyper-competitive game players. These folks would play things like Call of Duty, or the proprietary Halo series online a lot of the time. PlayStation players were more likely to have an extensive back catalog of one-player story-driven games, and Nintendo fans tended to be children. But it's not as if all games on these consoles were first-party titles, right? Where does this association come from? Let's explore. For obvious reasons, it'd be ridiculous to try to cover the entire history of the console wars, starting with Ataris and Nintendos and Segas. But Sony is a very peculiar case that sets the tone for the rest of the companies we'll be covering today. Sony is the youngest of the three in regards to time spent involved with video games. However, they've historically worked with companies like Nintendo on hardware for their consoles. Sony primarily worked in hardware, things like radios, CD players, stuff like that. Their roots are in the physical foundation of video games, the plastic and metal bits that help a developer deliver their dream directly to us, in our hearts and minds. Because of their prolific hardware abilities, Sony was contracted at one point to develop a disk drive for the Super Nintendo, or Super Famicom in non-US nations. In the 1990s, CDs, compact discs, were replacing cassette tapes, and many thinkers in the video game industry rightfully saw this trend overtaking the gaming sphere as well. So Nintendo thought they'd get ahead of the game by asking both Sony and Philips to work on disk drives for their consoles. Ultimately, Nintendo did decide to go with Philips on their disk drives, though some Nintendo PlayStations do exist. Sony ended up with most of a modern console's capabilities, but no actual console. So they reworked the Nintendo PlayStation into the Sony PlayStation and leapt onto the scene as one of the first disc-only gaming consoles. This drive to make quality hardware set them apart from competitors like Nintendo and Microsoft in the age of Xbox 360's Red Ring of Death and Nintendo's low hardware capabilities, forcing them to release dumbed-down ports of titles that play infinitely better on the PlayStation. Being backed by a huge hardware and entertainment company also helped them secure and start many beloved franchises, such as Shadow of the Colossus, God of War, The Last of Us, Spider-Man, and Twisted Metal, to name a few. Their detachment from the Nintendo franchise allowed them to pursue more mature game concepts, and their hardware pushed video game gore as we know it through the edgy, bloody, sassy 1990s and early 2000s. You can't say the word edgy without talking about the Xbox. This console line is responsible for so many trends and cliches in gaming. Of course, Nintendo and Sony had their parts to play in the grand rise of online gaming, but Microsoft and their Xbox are really the focal point of this earthquake, the epicenter, if you will. And for good reason. Xbox is far from Microsoft's first attempt in the video game market. As Sony was a hardware company turned into video games, Microsoft, as the name implies, was a software company that made a turn towards video games. Started by computer programmers, the company has always been known for pioneering programs and for releasing the first PC, or personal computer. This lands them directly in the genesis of computer or video gaming as we know it. After the US government opened up their ARPANET, a proto-online defense database, to the much more general TCP/IP model, the internet was born, and Microsoft would be on the ground floor of connecting the whole world via PC. From the foundations of this interconnectivity, it's not a leap to assume that the buzz generated around Halo Combat Evolved as an online game lit the fire that would eventually become Xbox Live, the quintessential online gaming service that set the template for everything that would come after it.
Here we go!
And of course I saved the best for last. Nintendo is the oldest company being discussed today, having been founded in 1889. What do we know about Nintendo? Well, they're very child-friendly and super proprietary about their brands. They own Super Mario Bros., which is arguably the bog standard of video game world building. They also own the world's biggest media franchise, Pokemon. They also own Legend of Zelda, which is arguably the most influential game franchise in terms of game development. What guides their philosophy? Well, originally Nintendo made playing cards that became really popular in Japan, especially among those who hung out at Yakuza betting bars in Kyoto. In the 1930s, new leadership decided to diversify the brand, and by the 1960s, Nintendo had partnered with Disney to print licensed cards for them in Japan. Nintendo made a boatload of money, as they always do, but had changed their image from Yakuza gambling accessories to children's trading card company. Throughout the 1970s, Nintendo would embrace this family-friendly imagery and began working in the burgeoning video games market, which they got into kind of sideways via expansion in the toy production department of the company. After working some time with Magnavox and witnessing the success of the Atari, Nintendo really hit their stride when they introduced Donkey Kong, which is arguably the original platformer as we know it. As we can see, Nintendo's popularity is less about the quality of its hardware or software, and more about the family-friendly imagery and branding which is seated on high-profile collaborations. It's no surprise that someone whose success is partially reliant on a contract with Disney would be aggressive in defending their brand from unauthorized usage. I also think it's extremely wise to guard their image, given how E for everyone their public persona is, to protect their brand from outside forces. They never had the best frame rate, and Lord knows their hardware design has been questionable at best. But kids love Mario. Kids love Pokemon. Kids love Kirby. Kids love Zelda. Nintendo never needed to be the top performer, they only needed to keep the kids happy. And I'd argue the success of the Mario movie, the fact that Pokemon is the largest media franchise in the world, their long legacy of revolutionizing game design with Zelda releases, show that they don't need to compete with Microsoft or Sony on their own turf. So that was an extremely basic breakdown of the company's histories for Sony Interactive, Microsoft, and Nintendo respectively. I think this provides a little insight onto why they operate the way they do. Some people see video games as a triumph of hardware capabilities, a beautiful opportunity to create a world so real you'll get lost in it. Others will see them as the ultimate social activity, an opportunity to open up an online store and bring friends from all over the world together to compete at the same time. And still others would see video games as modern toys, children's entertainment that ought to be crafted as such. No one's right and no one's wrong, but I do think it's interesting when you notice how Nintendo has been pushing motion control for over 30 years because it's a toy to them, or how Sony wouldn't really be in the video game market at all if it weren't for Nintendo. Hopefully you liked this video or learned something new from it if nothing else. Be sure to check me out live on Twitch if you want to yell at me about something. And subscribe here on YouTube. We just hit 100 subs, so you cannot be my 100th sub, but you can be my 101st. But no matter what you choose to do, thank you for watching my video, and I hope you have a great day.